Happy Sunday, everyone. Today we are talking about the difference, if there is one, between policy and doctrine in the restored Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're going to begin by going back to the 80s, a decade after the priesthood ban was lifted. The Associated Press did an interview with two apostles, Elders Neil Maxwell and Dallin Oakes. And in that interview, they were asked by the reporter, was the ban on ordaining blacks to the priesthood a matter of policy or doctrine? Really cutting to the heart of the matter that we're going to be talking about in this musing. Elder Maxwell replies by saying, well, I don't know. It certainly was church policy, and obviously with some considerable commentary from early church leaders about it. It's difficult for me to go beyond that. Elder Oakes, for his part, said, I don't know that it's possible to distinguish between policy and doctrine in a church that believes in continuing revelation and sustains its leader as a prophet. I'm not sure I could justify the difference in doctrine and policy in the fact that before 1978, a person could not hold the priesthood, and after 1978, they could hold the priesthood. So here are two apostles that are basically saying, I can't really talk about or don't really know the difference between policy and doctrine, or I'm not sure that it's possible to distinguish. How are we to interpret that? That's kind of an interesting thing. I think in the minds of a lot of members, there is doctrine and there are policies. That doctrine is kind of this unchanging thing. Policy is the changing stuff. This commentary perhaps is supported by Elder Haney in his infamous water bottle talk that he gave in 2023. Here's what he had to say.
Knowing by revelation that there's a living prophet on the earth changes everything. It causes one to be uninterested in the debate about when is a prophet speaking as a prophet, or whether one is ever justified in selective rejection of prophetic counsel. Such revealed knowledge invites one to trust the counsel of a living prophet, even if we do not fully understand it.
Okay, so we get this term prophetic counsel again, but the idea that type of stuff is doctrine, but what about policy? So in the following conference in October 2023, here is Elder John Pingree of the 70.
While doctrine never changes, policy adjusts from time to time. The Lord works through his prophets to uphold his doctrine and to modify church policies according to the needs of his children. Unfortunately, we sometimes confuse policy with doctrine. If we do not understand the difference, we risk becoming disillusioned when policies change, causing some to question God's wisdom or the revelatory role of prophets.
So if we don't understand the difference, we risk becoming disillusioned when policies change. And yet Elder Oakes was saying that it's not possible to distinguish. So then, is there a difference or isn't there? This confusion that exists, I think, is core to why a lot of members might struggle with their faith. I am a person who is very believing in the gospel, very committed to the gospel of Jesus Christ. I believe that God speaks through prophets, but I think that in our church culture, we run into problems when we think that all of the actions and statements made by these leaders of the church are prophetic and therefore doctrinal, but then when they change, people start to get worried and wait a minute, is God really at the helm, and so on and so forth, all stemming from this kind of conflation between the policy side and the doctrine side, even to the point where here's a member of the 70s saying, if we don't understand the difference between policies and doctrine, then we become, can become disillusioned or question God and prophets. Yet two apostles effectively were saying that there basically is no difference and that they don't understand it. This confusion is something I think we need to talk through and hopefully get to the bottom of. Now, assuming there is a difference between doctrine and policy, knowing what the difference is requires understanding what each one is. So what is doctrine? Let's begin with this clip from Elder Neil Anderson in 2012.
The doctrine is taught by all 15 members of the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12.
Okay, easy enough, right? Doctrine is what has consensus, at least right now. But that consensus, those views of those leaders of the church can change. If you look at the 1828 Webster Dictionary, how it defines doctrine, it says, in a general sense, whatever is taught. In a general sense, doctrine is whatever is taught, or as Elder Anderson would say, what is taught by all 15 members of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. Today's Webster Dictionary, by contrast, says that doctrine is a principle or position or the body of principles in a branch of knowledge or system of belief. But those principles, those positions can change. So it's whatever is taught. Doctrine is what is taught. Here's a church video that was put out talking about doctrine.
Doctrine. What is it? Why does it matter? God has always revealed doctrine through prophets. All doctrine is revealed by God. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believe that God speaks to us, His children, today as He did in Old Testament times. Doctrine is eternal truth revealed from God. It is unchanging and applicable to all of God's children at any time in the history of the world.
So this clarifies perhaps a little bit differently or a little bit more. It's not just whatever happens to be taught and agreed upon by the leaders of the church, the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12. Doctrine here, it's being alleged, is revealed by God. It is eternal truth. It is unchanging, which is interesting. And it's applicable to all of God's children at any time. This is a very high bar, a high standard for what constitutes doctrine. And yet, some of these very people, these leaders of the church, are not using that definition. They have a different definition that isn't quite the same. There's also then this idea of like, I've seen in various church statements, like the church newsroom years ago put out this article talking about policy and doctrine and so forth, and they used this term core doctrine, that there are certain doctrines that are the core of the gospel and other doctrines that are less important or more tangential. But the term that I've seen used far more than core doctrine is official doctrine. Let's watch this clip from Elder Oaks.
But let us not teach or use as official doctrine what does not meet the standards of official doctrine.
And then he was echoed 4 years prior by Elder Hales.
To keep the commandments, we need to know the official doctrine of the church, so we are not diverted from Christ's leadership by ever-changing whims of individuals.
So this term official doctrine, what does that mean, right? Elder Oaks in March of 2020 in the Ensign, he said that to become the official doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ, the individual teachings of apostles and even prophets need to be affirmed through the process of approval by other apostles and prophets, kind of echoing what Elder Anderson said, that it's whatever is taught by all 15 apostles and members of the First Presidency. Or I think of the church's essay on blacks in the priesthood. In there, they talk about how early leaders of the church, Brigham and others, restricted blacks from receiving their endowments, from being able to go to the temple. They say, over time, church leaders and members advanced many theories to explain the priesthood and temple restrictions. And then the essay says, none of these explanations is accepted today as the official doctrine of the church. And yet, as I've shared in a past musing, I think this is in the one that I did on Brigham Young, part 1, where I talked about his teachings on blacks in the priesthood and how it was false doctrine. Well, in 1949, I shared in that musing, the First Presidency said, the attitude of the church with reference to the Negroes remains as it has always stood. It is not a matter of the declaration of a policy, but of direct commandment from the Lord. Creating this contrast again, right? They're saying it's not a policy. It's not a policy. It is a declaration from the Lord, therefore doctrine, right? That's what was said in 1949. And yet now the church says that these explanations, these reasons given in the past are not the official doctrine of the church today. So it's not accepted today as official doctrine, but it used to be. But wait a minute, I thought doctrine was unchanging. And if there's official doctrine, as these statements have said, is there unofficial doctrine? Like, why use the term official if there's not unofficial? And what does that mean? Kind of confusing. Now, this concept of doctrine is what is taught by God, right? I completely agree with that. Doctrine is what is taught by God, either directly or through his prophets when they're actually speaking in the name of the Lord and actually being told by God to say what they're saying, right? Here is Elder Christofferson from 2012.
But in the church today, just as anciently, Establishing the doctrine of Christ or correcting doctrinal deviations is a matter of divine revelation to those the Lord endows with apostolic authority.
Again, this issue of divine direct revelation, a conduit of information directly from God. When the Doctrine and Covenants was being put together, when the revelations were being compiled, the Lord gave an additional revelation, which was intended to be the preface to the Book of Commandments, or the Doctrine and Covenants as we now know it today. And in there, in verse 38, the Lord says, "What I, the Lord, have spoken, I have spoken, and I excuse not myself. And though the heavens and the earth pass away, my word shall not pass away, but shall all be fulfilled. Whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same." So whatever God's servants say is God's voice and therefore doctrine, right? In other words, whatever the president of the church says or the prophet says is the Lord's voice and therefore is binding, right? And yet, here's Elder Christofferson in that same talk.
At the same time, it should be remembered that not every statement made by a church leader, past or present, necessarily constitutes doctrine. It is commonly understood in the church that a statement made by one leader on a single occasion often represents a personal, though well-considered opinion, not meant to be official or binding for the whole church.
3 decades prior, that same position was echoed by Elder Bruce McConkie, who wrote this open letter to the saints in 1980. And he says how he's just being inundated with all these letters and all these requests, and he can't answer them all. So he decided to put together this open letter where he would just share some thoughts that reflect common themes being asked across all these different letters. One of the questions that he's addressing is, are all prophetic utterances true? McConkie's answer: of course they are. This is what the Lord's system of teaching is all about. Anything which his servants say, when moved upon by the Holy Ghost, is Scripture, and his command to his ministers is, "The Spirit shall be given unto you by the prayer of faith, and if ye receive not the Spirit, ye shall not teach." McConkie continues, "But every word that a man who is a prophet speaks is not a prophetic utterance. Men who wear the prophetic mantle are still men. They have their own views, and their understanding of gospel truths is dependent upon the study and inspiration that is theirs." He ends this open letter, this portion of it, saying that if there's a conflict between a church leader's statement and the Scriptures, McConkie says, and I quote, "the Scriptures always take precedence." And yet we go to our water bottle loving friend, Elder Haney, who said the following:
Brothers and sisters, unlike vintage comic books and classic cars, prophetic teachings do not become more valuable with age. That is why we should not seek to use the words of past prophets to dismiss the teachings of living prophets.
Now, I think McConkie was right. I mean, Joseph Smith would agree with him. Joseph Smith recorded in his journal, a prophet is not always a prophet, only when he is acting as such, right? So the Scriptures take precedent over any conflict, because the Lord isn't going to conflict with himself. If doctrine is indeed unchanging, then what is said by men who may be sustained as prophets, seers, and revelators that conflicts, right, we evaluate it against the existing canon of revelation. So it presents this question, does doctrine change?
Gospel doctrine does not change.
That is from April 2022 from Elder Oaks. Very simply, it doesn't change. Just like the church's video said, I shared the little clip of, right? Doctrine is unchanging. And yet, the Adam God doctrine, so-called, was taught as doctrine, and then Spencer Kimball later denounced it as false doctrine. Interestingly, both he, at the time he said that, and Brigham Young, when he was teaching it, were presidents of the church, and thus the prophet when they taught this. The one teaching it as doctrine, the other saying that it's false doctrine. Polygamy was taught as an eternal doctrine. And then President Hinckley, in an interview with Larry King in 1998, said, "I condemn polygamy, yes, as a practice, because I think it is not doctrinal." You've got Fair, the apologists on behalf of the church, saying, despite the fact that rules regarding polygamy are outlined in section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the church no longer teaches it as doctrine. It was taught as doctrine in the 1800s. It is not taught as doctrine today. There is no doctrine that allows the present practice of plural marriage in the church. Its practice is not doctrinal. So what before was doctrinal now no longer apparently is. I think I've shared this before. I did a musing like a year ago on will we get our own planet, and if we're in the celestial kingdom and in heaven, and kind of addressing those ideas. So I'll just touch on this lightly, but in the church's newsroom, frequently asked questions, when talking about this idea, they say, this idea is not taught in Latter-day Saint scripture, nor is it a doctrine of the church. This misunderstanding stems from speculative comments, unreflective of scriptural doctrine. They're saying it's not doctrinal that anyone's going to, have or create or inherit their own, worlds one day. And yet in the correlation approved Gospel Fundamentals manual that the church still utilizes, it says that those who achieve the highest level of heaven will even be able to have spirit children and make new worlds for them to live on and do all the things our Father in heaven has done. I think this one is more of an issue of bad public relations than anything for the church newsroom to be kind of denying it like they did. But the point is they're saying, oh, that's not doctrine. And then, well, wait a minute, it's being taught by the church in its manuals, which are approved by the leaders of the church. So doesn't that reflect doctrine? Like the church wouldn't be putting out false ideas in their own manuals. Final example, the Journal of Discourses. Here is from an introduction to one of the volumes of the Journal of Discourses. It says that the Journal of Discourses deservedly ranks as one of the standard works of the church. Of course, necessarily implying that it's doctrine, that it's canon, that it's one of the standard works along with the Bible and the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants. And yet on the church's website today, it reads, the Journal of Discourses is not an official publication of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Journal of Discourses includes interesting and insightful teachings by early church leaders. However, by itself, it is not an authoritative source of church doctrine. As an aside, it's kind of interesting that it says it's not an official publication of the church, which is only because the church at the time did not own any printing presses in England where this was being printed, so they were printed by a third party. But it was commissioned and overseen and approved and funded by the First Presidency, which the church, paid them to have it printed. And by that measure, you could say that the Book of Mormon is not an official publication because someone else owned the printing press. That it was like this kind of this weird thing to try and get away from the Journal of Discourses by saying it's not an official publication. For all intents and purposes, it was. It's just that the church needed to kind of rent out through a separate publisher rather than having their own. Okay, so what's the difference between policy and doctrine? I saw someone snarky online that I chuckled at a little bit, said, doctrine is anything taught or supported by current church leadership. Policy is any doctrine that current members are embarrassed about, right? Like it's doctrine, it's unchanging until for whatever reason in the future it is, and then we call it policy, even though at one point it was called doctrine. So then what is policy? I mean, policy in my mind, it's administrative, it's changing, it's flexible, adapting to the culture, the circumstances of the people. It's an implementation of doctrine, perhaps, right? And yet this stuff gets conflated. I think of going back to the example of the blacks and the priesthood. This is from Greg Prince, who's the historian looking into David McKay. And in that write-up, he says, within weeks of President McKay's return from South Africa, McKay met privately with Sterling McMurrin in the course of their conversation, and to McMurrin's surprise, McKay told him that the church position on ordination of blacks was policy, not doctrine, and that the practice would someday be changed. McKay chose his words carefully, and it is clear in retrospect that his use of the word policy did not mean the practice of priesthood denial could be reversed merely by administrative decision. Indeed, he always affirmed, both in public and in private, that it would take a revelation for such to occur. However, he also affirmed that such a revelation could occur, and therein lay the distinction in his own mind. To him, a policy could be changed, albeit in this case only upon receipt of a revelation, whereas a doctrine could not be changed. This could be akin perhaps to when the Lord told Peter to go start preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, right? The policy was first we don't, and then the policy later was that we do, but God gave that revelation and he told that to Peter. So maybe my perception is wrong, but it's not just administrative, because here President McKay was saying even these church policies have to be guided by revelation. So then what is the functional equivalent of the word policy versus the word doctrine? If really all we're talking about is the doctrines or whatever hasn't been changed in the past, But if any of the past doctrines have been changed, we now call them policies, even though they were changed through revelation. Like it gets a little bit muddy because policies, do change. You have the notorious policy a decade ago of saying that the kids of gay couples can't get baptized. And then like 4 years later, that was reversed and overturned. The church claimed in both cases that, or kind of inferred that there was inspiration and revelation, which naturally prompts the question, of why God is like, do this, and then all of a sudden do the opposite. And there could be plausible reasons for that. I'm not saying that's, beneath or above God to require these about faces like that. But it's a policy. Who's allowed to get baptized? And it was one way, and then it was another, and then it was changed back. The Moroni statues on temples, that's a policy that's been changed. Not praying to open the second hour of church. The length of service for bishops and stake presidents, the changes in temple ceremonies, for example, the changing in format and requirements of garments. Like, we can go through a bunch of these examples showing how there are policies that do change. Therefore, I guess we call them policies. We presume that all of those changes are guided by the Lord's revelation. I am still very persuaded by the fact that most policies probably are not, that they're well-meaning, that they're trying their best, but the Lord is not micromanaging church affairs in every jot and tittle such that all the policies in the handbook. I mean, if you ever glance through the handbook, it's very beefy. It's full of a ton of policies. I don't think that the Lord is micromanaging all the minutia of this policy versus that and the other. I think there is a difference between policy and doctrine. But Elder Oaks' quote at the beginning, basically saying that I don't think it's possible to distinguish between policy and doctrine in a church that believes in continuing revelation and sustains its leader as a prophet, I think that reflects the actual church position on the matter, that there is no functional difference between policy and doctrine. Why do I say this? Look at the church's handbook in 32.6.3.2 when it's talking about apostasy. Here is what it currently says. As used here, apostasy refers to a member engaging in any of the following: repeatedly acting in clear and deliberate public opposition to the church, its doctrine, its policies, or its leaders. So if you can get kicked out of the church, excommunicated or disfellowshipped, or have your membership withdrawn, as we are now more euphemistically and politely calling it, if you can have your church membership withdrawn because you are in opposition to church policies, then I think those policies have been elevated to doctrine, right? I don't know that you can say there's any difference or distinction. So I think what Elder Oak said reflects the church's position, that policies are treated on par with doctrine. It says right here, apostasy can be acting in opposition to doctrine or to policies, the church or its leaders. Now, I think the church's view, no doubt, is that the policies are based on doctrine. That yes, they can change, but while they're in effect, you're not allowed to oppose them. So it's almost like it's a subcategory or subgenre, right? We've got these doctrines, and then beneath them we got these policies, but the Lord is behind it all. So if you oppose any of it, then you can have your membership withdrawn because you're in apostasy. So basically, imbues policies with the same reverential spiritual implication that we reserve typically for doctrine. Now, the previous version of the handbook, interestingly, in 2010, had a different definition of apostasy, one that omitted the doctrine and policies. Before, it said that apostasy is referring to members who repeatedly act in clear, open, and deliberate public opposition to the church or its leaders. So both doctrine and policies was added, which is kind of interesting. All right, let's wrap up with some concluding thoughts. The first one is, it would appear, from my perspective and opinion, that our own church leaders don't seem to be able to concretely distinguish between what is changeable policy and what is unchangeable doctrine. And we might ask ourselves in response to that, does it matter? I mean, is everything changeable policy if the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency vote to change it? Is everything subject potentially to change as long as there can somehow be consensus with the leaders of the church? And then if what was thought to be doctrine before then somehow requires modification, does it then change to become a policy because it was considered doctrine? but now we all agree that for whatever reasons we need to change it, so it never was doctrine? Like it's kind of, there doesn't seem to be a very clear understanding, even among the leaders of the church who are saying different things, to create any bright lines or help create any sufficient clarity to mitigate the confusion that exists when we're trying to understand what is the one versus the other. If all 15 of the apostles agree on something, or if, a simple majority vote on it behind closed doors or whatever, sufficient to make a change, that becomes the church's doctrine, right? Doctrine and policy are really, I think, exactly the same in today's church. And these differing definitions that exist, I mean, I think they get boiled down into two. The one is doctrine is the unchanging truth of the gospel. And then the second is doctrine is whatever is taught by all the leaders of the church in unison together. Now, that can be a Venn diagram with a lot of overlap, right? That the 15 apostles, the 12 plus the first presidency, that they are in consensus about the unchanging truths of the gospel. But there's also, outside of that overlap in the Venn diagram, there's that outer edge, which is that there can be some consensus by leaders of the church, which then gets called doctrine because it's consensus by those who define doctrine that way, as whatever is being taught by all the leaders of the church. That gets called doctrine, and yet that, whatever they're teaching, may not be an unchanging truth of the gospel. Hence the confusion. I mean, it's kind of amazing that we can't even really agree on these basic core definitions of what is a doctrine in the church and what is unchanging, because things that were once said to be unchanging have changed. So does that open the door for supposedly unchanging things today to one day become changing? And then if that happens, is it called a policy at that point? Like, how does this stuff work? If elders Maxwell and Oakes can't tell the difference between policy and doctrine, then I would suggest that there isn't much difference, if any. Like, I feel like there is. I feel like in my mind, I can see a difference between policy and doctrine. I think doctrine is what clearly is from God, that it is indeed unchanging, but that what is purported to be doctrine is received by mortal men, filtered through their bias, their prejudice, their limited understanding. They're seeing through a glass darkly, like the rest of us in many ways, and so we can get these interpretations and teachings that aren't exactly the raw, unchanging truth of the gospel. But as Elder McConkie said, that yes, when there is a prophetic utterance, when it is truly directly from God, then it's not just whatever prophetic counsel is and teaching and encouraging, filtered through all the personal frailties of a fallible person, even if that person is the president of the church. And it's more like doctrine is a word that leaders use when they support a belief that they don't want to be changed. Here is this hallowed status of doctrine. These are the things that we don't want changed. And then policy becomes a word that leaders use when they have suspicion or doubt about a particular belief or practice. Maybe they do want to change it. Maybe there isn't consensus among all the leaders of the church about how we handle that, or whatever the issue is. Then policy gets reserved for those things where there's some difference of opinion or some interest in changing the way we do things. The problem, I think, all boils down to the fact that members of the church attribute much stronger meaning to the term doctrine, less so with policy. I think most members probably presume that even the policies are being guided by the Lord, but there's clearly this elevated status of doctrine. And yet if leaders of the church themselves are saying we don't really see a difference between the two, I think we ought to take that under advisement and realize that, just as they say apostasy is if you are in opposition to the policies of the church, they've been elevated up to the same level as doctrine. And I think leaders are okay with how members are interpreting that, the elevated status for doctrine, because if at any point the leaders of the church want to change something, then regardless of labels, they can still do it. They just end up calling it a policy. We've been through this before, as with blacks in the priesthood and other things, where what was claimed to be doctrine is later called a policy. So the question is, for us today, how does that give us confidence to know what truly is doctrine? People like to claim, for example, that the doctrine of the family, right? The proclamation on the family, the premortal identity of gender. You got people within the church or outside of the church who are like, oh, that has to change, and advocating for it to change. And then you have a lot of people defending it, saying, no, that is unchangeable doctrine. But when you look at the past and you see that certain things were defended by saying that is unchangeable doctrine, and then it was later changed, I think it weakens our ability to concretely say, here are these unchangeable doctrines, if in the end all it takes is the consensus of the leaders of the church to change something and call it doctrine. Now, we believe that these men are guided by God, that they're not going to go off the rails and suddenly, call something doctrine that isn't. But that I think presents the challenge. These things, these terms are kind of fluid. I feel like they don't have the kind of concrete delineation that people might like to see terms like these have. And so then we get buffeted about with every wind of doctrine or policy if we don't clearly understand that as a policy subject to change, whether through revelation or just the good, well-intentioned administrative decisions of church leaders who have that prerogative, versus here is doctrine. You read the scriptures and Jesus is like, this is my doctrine to, love one another, get baptized, the very, very basics, what some in the church might call the core doctrines, right? And then you get these other doctrines, these official doctrines that still may just be the consensus of the leaders of the church, as was the case with, blacks in the priesthood or Adam God and so forth, until it's no longer the consensus and future leaders of the church call it false doctrine, as Kimball did about the Adam God doctrine. I see people struggle with these issues when they discover them because they don't know how to navigate around these landmines. What they took for granted, what they were taught in the past, they suddenly see fall apart, and they don't have the ability perhaps to process that or the intellectual foundation to kind of logically think through this. All they kind of know and interpret in their head is, wait a minute, like they claimed that was doctrine, which I've always been taught is unchanging, but then they changed it. And then these people often in this position start to just throw out everything and just dismiss or question everything. Because if you said that was doctrine, how can I have any trust in any of this other stuff? And that saddens me, because I think there's a lot of nuance here. I think there's a lot of cultural baggage where we just presume everything is prophetic when it's not necessarily like from God. We presume these well-intentioned policies are all guided by revelation, but then they change them and they move them around, and who knows? And so I think there's this, I don't know, something is lost in translation where we don't have a lot of clarity about these things are completely directly from God. They are unchanging, bar none, because we have a church history sprinkled with some of these examples that show the opposite. And so my hope is that we can have more clarity here. I think it would benefit the church to have the teachings of its leaders of the church, even when there's consensus, cautioned and conditioned on, we received a direct revelation on this, therefore it is doctrine, versus let's just presume, like Elder Haney in his water bottle story, that everything is prophetic counsel and that we're, everything that the president of the church is doing is guided and inspired and revelatory. Therefore, we just imbue all of his words and actions with, right? And we do that over the generations. We create these implications of what prophetic counsel is or what presidents of the church are saying and doing. And then we run into problems when those actions are overturned or opposed, or we do a 180. You had President Hinckley who's saying the term Mormon is great, and now you got President Nelson saying, it's a tool of Satan type of thing. So I think we need more clarity about, frankly, when the leaders of the church are performing their function truly as a prophet, revealing the mind and the will of the Lord. And then we need this discretion or this separate category of like, here's all these other good, well-intentioned teachings, even they have consensus by the leaders of the church, but this isn't a thus saith the Lord. Therefore, be okay if some of this ends up being wrong in the future, because it doesn't reach this core doctrine level of something directly from the Lord in thus saith the Lord fashion, right? We have this I don't know, this middle ground, this gray area in the middle where I see a lot of spiritual damage being done in the circles that I run in, of people who are losing their testimony because they can't kind of compute this. I hope for more clarity so that we can avoid those landmines, that we can support people in having faith in God. I believe God does call prophets. I believe he has called prophets. I believe he does speak through prophets, that we can access God's will and mind and understand his word through that role. But I think we've created a lot of confusion along the way by considering things to be prophetic that aren't actually the case, by considering things to be doctrine that were in fact not true and therefore not unchanging because they were later said to be false and were changed. So I want to put that all in the past, I hope, and move forward as a church body. I would love to see us be able to have more clarity, to delineate these things a little bit more, and to I don't know, just have more definition around them, because I've seen what the confusion has caused in some of the people that I know and talk to online that are struggling with this. Maybe I'm up in the night. Maybe it's a total minority issue. Maybe you have more clarity around policy versus doctrine, or if there is any distinction and difference. Be curious to hear in the comments if you have other thoughts, any scriptures that come to mind, experiences that you've had. This is something I feel like is tricky to navigate for a lot of people, and curious what you think about the need for more clarity. So I'll see you in the comments, and I'll see you next Sunday.